George Clarence Seitz was born on December 12, 1894. He was a decorated American World War I veteran who had been living in the Queensboro of New York City at the time of his disappearance. On December 10, 1976, George left his home in Jamaica, Queens to get a haircut and never came back. For 43 years, no one knew what happened to George. It's as though he simply vanished into thin air. And then, one day in 2019, detectives received a tip from a woman in her 50s. She wanted to get something off her chest and share a secret she had kept for over 40 years. She told detectives that in December of 1976, when she was just 10 years old, she saw her mother's boyfriend dismember a body and bury it in his backyard. The woman had waited decades to tell the police because she was afraid of intimidation and possible retaliation. The next day, police showed up with cadaver dogs and began scouring the area. It didn't take long for the dogs to stop and begin digging, signaling that they had found something. Once police excavated the backyard, they found decomposed human remains. But there was a problem. The police had no idea who this person was. They needed to identify this man to bring closure to his family and put his killer behind bars. Initially, the police crisscrossed the country and compared his genetic material with genealogy data from at-home testing services in order to find his surviving relatives. Unfortunately, that didn't lead anywhere, even after the medical examiner was able to put together a DNA profile of the victim. The big break came 2 years later, in 2021, when police sought help from an outside laboratory which was able to connect the victim to his relatives using publicly accessible databases such as 23andMe and Ancestry.com. That's when they identified the remains belonging to Mr. Seitz. After an extensive investigation, police were able to connect Martin Mora to the victim. Mr. Mora owned a barbershop where Mr. Seitz went to get his haircut, and it was in his backyard that the body had been buried. Police believed that the motive was robbery, as it was common knowledge that the 82-year-old veteran carried with him lots of cash, often all of his savings, wherever he went. Mr. Mora undoubtedly knew this, which led to the murder. Police also believe that he died soon after he entered the barbershop. At the time of his murder, the neighborhood and especially the street where George lived had been extremely dangerous. One of the neighbors recalled having experienced 6 burglaries at his house. Eventually, he needed to install a 6-foot chain link fence to deter future robberies. Mr. Mora was subsequently arrested and charged with second-degree murder. His bail was denied. He is currently awaiting trial at the notorious prison on Rikers Island, New York. According to the lead detective on the case, it's very rare to get a tip more than 40 years later that ends up cracking a cold case wide open. Through the passage of time, allegiances change, alliances change, brotherhoods change, continued the detective. People also underestimate the impact witnessing a murder has on the human conscience. The following is the oldest case in the United States to be solved using genetic genealogy. On January 2, 1956, a teenage couple disappeared in Great Falls, Montana. They were Duane Bogle and Patricia Kalitzke. Mrs. Kalitzke was a junior at Great Falls High School. Mr. Bogle was an airman from Waco, Texas, stationed nearby at Malmstrom Air Force Base. And according to John Cadner, a sergeant with the Cascade County Sheriff's Office, Duane was instantly smitten with Patty when they met in December 1955. They both loved dancing and music. The teenagers were last seen at Pete's Drive-In restaurant in Great Falls just after 9 p.m. on January 2nd, 1956. When they didn't come home that night, their families assumed something had happened to them and filed a missing persons report with the police. The following day, 3 boys hiking along the Sun River in Great Falls found Mr. Bogle's body in an area that was known as a meeting spot for teenagers. He was face down and had been shot in the back of the head. His hands had been tied behind his back with his own belt. The ignition switch, radio, and headlights on his car were on, and the car was in gear. His expensive camera had not been taken. When they didn't find Patricia's body nearby, investigators feared that she may have been kidnapped. But the next day, on January 4th, 1956, a county road worker found her body off a gravel road about 5 miles north of Great Falls. She had been shot in the head and had injuries that were consistent with struggle or a sexual assault. For more than half a century, detectives investigated about 35 potential suspects, including James Bulger, the notorious South Boston mobster who was convicted in 2013 of having committed 11 murders. Mr. Bulger, who died in 2018, had lived in Great Falls in the 1950s and had been arrested in a rape there in 1951. After the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, known as the Golden State Killer, who was accused of committing 13 murders and nearly 50 rapes that terrorized California in the 1970s and 80s, investigators turned to genetic genealogy in 2018. After all, the capture of Mr. DeAngelo was the first high-profile case to be cracked with genetic genealogy. The lead detective, Sergeant Cadner, said the crucial piece of evidence was a DNA sample from a sperm cell that had been collected from Mrs. Kalitzke's body during her autopsy. That sample had been preserved in an evidence vault for 6 decades. In 2001, it had been sent to the state crime lab for analysis, but did not lead to any matches in a national criminal database. In 2019, with the help of both technology, a Virginia company that specializes in DNA analysis, another DNA profile was extracted from the sample, which enabled investigators to build a family tree that led them to Kenneth Gourd. Mr. Gourd, who was 29 in 1956, lived just a mile from Mrs. Kalitzke's house and kept horses about 600 yards from the house where she had grown up. He had married another 16-year-old girl in 1952 and eventually had 5 children. After the killings, he left the area and was seen living in 2 other Montana towns before moving to Alton, Missouri in 1967. Because Mr. Gourd had been cremated, investigators collected DNA from his children, which linked Mr. Gourd to the sperm cell that had been found on Mrs. Kalitzke's body. Mr. Gourd had no known criminal history, and detectives do not know if he had any relationship with Mrs. Kalitzke or Mr. Bogle. He never returned to Montana, even to visit his family. Mr. Gourd died in 2007 at age 79 in Oregon County, Missouri. Mr. Gourd's children, 3 of whom submitted DNA samples, were all surprised to be told that their father was being investigated in connection with a double homicide in 1956. His daughter basically said, "You never know. Some people just have secrets that they never told anybody. In 1963, when Mary Scott was just 17 years old, she dropped out of high school and married a Navy man. They had 2 children. Later, the couple moved to Louisiana, and Mrs. Scott then took her children to California. Eventually, the children remained with their father and his family, and Mrs. Scott remained alone in California. Shortly after, she began working as a cocktail waitress and then as a dancer nicknamed Lucky at a local club. On November 20th, 1969, Miss Scott's co-worker went to look for her at her apartment and found her dead. Miss Scott had been strangled and raped, the furniture was in disarray, and the chain was broken on the door. Scott's friend and co-worker, Dolores Christopherson, found Scott lying face up on the floor of her apartment. Detectives found evidence that she was raped. The door to Scott's apartment was broken. Detectives concluded that she was getting ready for bed when she heard a knock on the door. She then opened the door just a bit with the security chain latched. As soon as she opened the door, the offender immediately pushed the door in, hitting it so hard that it completely broke off the security chain and the door molding. He then hit Mary's face so hard that it broke her jaw. A rumor that Mary Scott was the victim of a Las Vegas mob hit was investigated, and suspects in other sexual assaults in the area were questioned. It wasn't immediately clear what was the motive in the murder, but it was believed that it was someone who knew Mary Scott personally. Although investigators had tried to follow various leads, occasionally filling in her family about their efforts, the case eventually went cold. A few years ago, Scott's sister began learning how DNA technology was helping investigators find suspects in other murders, including the D'Angelo case. She wondered if this can help find her sister's murder as well. In 2019, the year of the 50th anniversary of the murder, she contacted a friend, a retired police officer, and asked him to look into how this emergent DNA technology might help to solve her sister's murder. The friend contacted people still in the police force, and a new search was born. In late 2020, the San Diego Police Department announced that, with the help of forensic genealogy, a suspect had been identified. On October 24th, John Jeffrey Sipos, 75, was arrested in Schnecksville, Pennsylvania, in the murder of Miss Scott. Military records show that Sipos was stationed at Naval Air Station Miramar in 1969, and one of his addresses was just 2 miles from Scott's apartment. Military personnel frequented the Star and Garter strip club, where Miss Scott was a dancer. On July 22, 2020, Trash Day on Cobbler Road in North Whitehall, FBI agents went through Sipos' trash and found a bandage. In September, lab test results matched the DNA in the blood to the evidence on Scott's body. Sipos denied involvement in the murder, denied knowing the victim, and said he would never associate with someone like that. He was referring to a go-go dancer. If convicted, Sipos faces a sentence of 7 years to life, because that was the sentence for first-degree murder in California at the time of Scott's death. It's currently 25 years to life. This case is one of the latest to benefit from advances in DNA and genetic genealogy, which have given new momentum to dormant murder files in the United States as well as around the world, helping investigators track down suspects and families find justice and closure. Her sister said she reflects on the 50 years of life that Mr. Sipos had, and that her sister had lost. He went on to live his life, she said, and that is the thing that makes me the most upset. When I learn that he's just living free and happy, it is upsetting to me that he had the normal life all these years. She had so much life ahead of her that just got stolen.